The courtroom fell silent as the little boy stood, trembling in his oversized suit. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. All eyes were fixed on him, on 8-year-old Jackson Walker. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. Jackson had just taken the stand. His mother, seated in the front row, was holding her breath, eyes wide, hands clasped together in prayer. His father, a stoic man, was seated beside her. They had come to this point hoping for a miracle, but nothing could have prepared them for what Jackson was about to say. The prosecutor had been relentless, trying to break the boy's resolve with question after question. But Jackson didn't falter. His voice, small but steady, rang out across the courtroom, echoing in every corner. "Because it was my daddy," he said, his words piercing the heavy silence. The room gasped. The air seemed to grow colder. His father's face went pale, his eyes widening in disbelief. Jackson's mother looked like she had been struck by a bolt of lightning. "My daddy hurt me, and my mommy, and I saw him hurt other people too," Jackson continued, his eyes locked on the judge, his voice unwavering. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People whispered furiously, some in shock, others in anger. But Jackson didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His family's entire world was about to collapse, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But just as quickly as the chaos had erupted, a terrifying silence followed. Jackson's father stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back with a loud crash. "No!" he shouted, his voice cracking, his body shaking with fury. "You're lying! You're lying about all of it!" But Jackson wasn't lying. The truth had been set free, and there was no turning back now. He had just exposed the man who had terrorized their family for years, and there was nothing his father could do to silence him. As Jackson's father lunged toward him, the courtroom security quickly moved in, restraining him before he could do anything. His mother cried out, rushing to her son's side. But Jackson was already staring at his father, his face calm, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth he had just shared. The judge slammed down his gavel. "Order in the court," he shouted, but no one could hear him over the noise of the moment. And then, in a heartbeat, everything went still again. The courthouse was still buzzing with whispers, but Jackson sat quietly, his small hands clenched tightly together in his lap. His mother, Caroline, had wrapped him in her arms the moment the chaos had died down. The boy was shaken, but his resolve had not wavered. He had spoken the truth, and he knew it. But now, everything felt different. Jackson's eyes flicked nervously toward his father, who was being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in Jackson's gaze, just sorrow. His father had been everything to him once, the man who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had carried him on his shoulders to the park. But now, that image was shattered, replaced with the painful truth. Caroline was a mixture of relief and fear. She had always suspected something was wrong with her husband, but hearing the truth spoken aloud made her stomach churn. Her son's courage had saved her, but it had also torn their world apart. She held Jackson tighter, wishing she could shield him from what was coming next. She wasn't sure if they could survive this. As they walked down the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed them. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession, but Caroline kept her eyes fixed ahead, her grip on Jackson tightening. She wasn't ready for the world to know their story, not yet. "Mrs. Walker." "Jackson," one reporter called out, his voice sharp above the crowd. "How does it feel to finally have the truth out? What will happen to your husband?" Caroline's heart raced. She knew the moment was coming, the moment when their entire lives would be exposed. Jackson squeezed her hand, looking up at her with wide eyes, and she knew it was time to face the world, no matter how terrifying it felt. "We're just trying to take it one day at a time," Caroline said, her voice steady but forced. "Thank you for your concern, but we're not ready to talk yet." The reporters didn't relent. "Jackson, how do you feel now that you've spoken out? Were you afraid?" Jackson's eyes met the camera, and for the briefest of moments, his gaze flickered with uncertainty. But then, he found his voice again. "I'm not afraid," he said, his words quiet but firm. "I did what I had to do." The reporters paused, some taken aback by his strength. But others continued to shout questions, pushing for more. Caroline pulled Jackson closer, shielding him from the invasive cameras. The drive home was long and quiet. Caroline couldn't help but glance over at her son, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. Had she done the right thing? Would this ruin their lives for good? But Jackson was silent, staring out the window, his face a mask of exhaustion. When they finally arrived at their modest house, Jackson didn't immediately run to his room like he normally did. Instead, he stood by the door, his shoulders slumped. "Mom, is Daddy really gone?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling just a bit. Caroline's heart ached. She kneeled down in front of him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "He's not coming back, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you're safe now. You're safe." The doorbell rang, and Caroline froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, not at this hour. She hesitated before answering, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. When she opened the door, she found her sister, Lisa, standing there with a look of shock and disbelief on her face. "I just saw the news," Lisa said, her voice strained. "I can't believe it. How is Jackson? Is he okay?" Caroline stepped aside to let her sister in, but before she could respond, Jackson turned to her with a serious look in his eyes. "I'm fine, Aunt Lisa," he said softly, though his voice held a quiet strength. "I'm fine because I told the truth." His words hit harder than anything Caroline had expected. Her son wasn't just fine. He was stronger than anyone had ever realized. He had faced something most adults would have crumbled under, and he had done it with the courage of a warrior. But as the night wore on, the full impact of what had happened began to set in. Caroline knew the next days would be filled with press conferences, interviews, and endless scrutiny. They had opened a door that could never be closed again. And Jackson had just changed everything for their family. But there was one thing Caroline couldn't shake from her mind. A thought that lingered, a feeling that gnawed at her gut. What if Jackson wasn't the only one who had been holding onto the truth all these years? The sun was setting, casting a dull orange glow over the neighborhood as Caroline sat on the couch, her thoughts swirling. The weight of the day, of the shocking revelations in court, had drained her. She could barely find the energy to think about what came next, what Jackson would face, what her family would endure. It felt like the world had turned upside down, and there was no getting back to the way things were. But then, a knock at the door shattered her moment of silence. Jackson's voice echoed from the hallway. "I'll get it, Mom." She barely had time to react before Jackson opened the door, his face pale. Standing there was a man in a dark suit, someone Caroline didn't recognize. "I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am," the man said, his voice cold and formal. "But we need to talk. It's about your husband." Caroline's heart sank. It had only been hours since her husband had been arrested, and already, it seemed like everything was coming down on her at once. She took a deep breath and walked toward the door, her hand instinctively reaching for Jackson, who was now standing behind her. "What is this about?" Caroline asked, her voice wavering. The man looked past her and focused on Jackson, his eyes sharp and calculating. "It's about your son's testimony. We believe he may be in danger." Caroline's pulse quickened. "Danger? What do you mean?" The man hesitated for a moment before speaking again, this time with more urgency in his voice. "There's something you need to understand. Your husband, he wasn't acting alone. We believe there may be others involved. And Jackson might have unwittingly put himself in harm's way by speaking out today." Jackson's hand tightened around Caroline's as the man's words hung heavy in the air. Caroline's mind raced. Could it be true? Had she unknowingly exposed her son to even greater dangers by forcing her husband's secrets into the light? "Who are these people?" Caroline demanded, her voice shaking. "And what are you going to do to protect my son?" The man stepped back slightly, his eyes flicking nervously to the street, before he glanced down at Jackson once more. "We're investigating. But I can't go into details right now. Just know that Jackson's bravery today has put him in the crosshairs of those who will do anything to protect their secrets. We need to keep him safe." Jackson looked up at the man, his expression serious. "What do you mean? Who would want to hurt me?" The man remained silent for a moment, and Caroline could see the conflict in his eyes. "There are people in this world who don't want the truth to come out. Your father, he wasn't just involved in the things you witnessed. There's a much bigger network of corruption. And now, they'll do whatever it takes to keep it hidden." Caroline's stomach twisted. She wanted to believe that things would go back to normal, that Jackson would have his childhood back, that they could leave the past behind them. But now, it was clear that things had changed forever. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Caroline. "Take this. It's a temporary relocation plan for Jackson and you. For your safety." Caroline took the envelope without a word, her hands trembling. She glanced at Jackson, his face pale but determined. "Do you understand?" the man asked, his voice urgent. Caroline nodded, but her mind was spinning. The idea of running, of uprooting everything, was overwhelming. She hadn't even fully processed what had happened in the courtroom, let alone the fact that her son might be in even more danger than she had realized. "Mom," Jackson said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we going to be okay?" Caroline turned to her son, her heart breaking. She had no answers for him, not yet. But she knew one thing for sure: whatever it took, she would protect him. She would do anything to keep him safe. "I'm not sure," she whispered back. "But we're in this together, okay? We'll figure it out." As the man left their doorstep, Caroline felt the weight of the envelope in her hand, a physical reminder of how much had changed in such a short time. Her world was no longer simple. It was a maze of fear, secrecy, and uncertainty. And she had no idea what lay ahead. But one thing was clear: they could never go back to the life they had before. The night was thick with unease. Caroline sat at the kitchen table, the envelope unopened in front of her. Her mind raced as she stared at it, her thoughts tangled with the man's warning. Jackson sat across from her, his legs dangling from the chair, too small for the weight of the situation that had been thrust upon him. His wide eyes kept glancing toward the envelope, but he didn't ask. He didn't need to. They both knew that opening it would mean stepping into a world of uncertainty, of running, of never looking back. "Mom," Jackson's voice broke through her thoughts. "Is this really happening? Is Dad really gone?" Caroline's heart clenched at his words. She had promised herself that she would shield Jackson from the harshness of this world, that she would protect him from the ugliness that had been hiding in the shadows. But now, that was impossible. The truth had come out in the most public of ways, and there was no way to undo it. "I don't know, Jackson," Caroline said softly, her voice tight. "But I know we can't go back to the way things were. We have to be strong. And we'll get through this, okay?" Jackson nodded, though there was doubt in his eyes. The little boy who had spoken the truth in court, who had stood up to the man who had hurt him, was now lost in the gravity of their situation. Caroline didn't blame him. She was lost too. She reached for the envelope and opened it slowly, almost hesitantly. Inside, there was a thick stack of papers, each one more official than the last. A temporary relocation plan, a list of phone numbers for various security agencies, instructions for a covert transfer to a safer location. The words on the page were stark, and each sentence seemed to hold a new layer of fear. She swallowed hard as she read. The plan wasn't just a temporary move. It was a complete uprooting, a change of identity, and most terrifying of all, it meant they would be leaving everything behind. Friends, family, the home Jackson had grown up in. They would disappear into the shadows, moving from one place to another until whoever was looking for them had given up. Caroline closed her eyes, her mind spinning. What choice did they have? "Mom, where will we go?" Jackson asked, his voice small, almost lost. Caroline didn't answer right away. She could feel the weight of his question in her bones, the heaviness of it pressing down on her. She had to protect him, but she didn't know how to navigate this new world. She had always been the protector, but now, the roles were reversed. Jackson had become the one who had to be shielded from the consequences of his own bravery. She sighed deeply, looking at the stack of papers again. "We're going to have to leave, Jackson. But we'll stay together. We'll be okay." Jackson seemed to accept that answer, though his face remained tense. He stood up and walked over to the window, staring out into the night, his small frame silhouetted against the dark sky. Caroline watched him, feeling a pang of guilt twist in her chest. She wished she could tell him that everything would be okay, that they would wake up tomorrow and everything would go back to normal. But she couldn't. That wasn't their reality anymore. The silence between them felt heavy, but it was broken when there was a loud knock at the door. Caroline froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone, not at this hour. Not after everything that had happened. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Caroline," a familiar voice called back, low and cautious. It was Lisa. Caroline quickly moved to the door and opened it, relief flooding her when she saw her sister's face. "Thank God you're here," Caroline whispered, stepping aside to let Lisa in. Lisa's eyes were wide, her hands trembling. "I just heard about the plan," she said, her voice frantic. "You can't go through with this, Caroline. It's too dangerous." Caroline frowned, her mind still spinning. "What do you mean?" "They said Jackson could be in danger. We have to do this." Lisa shook her head, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. "I'm not talking about the plan. I'm talking about something else. The people your husband was involved with, they don't stop. They'll come after you no matter where you go. There's no running from them." Caroline's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Lisa said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "that they know you're going to run. They know everything. They'll be waiting." The words hit Caroline like a punch to the gut. She felt the blood drain from her face, her hands suddenly cold and clammy. "You're telling me," Caroline said slowly, "that we can't even escape? That we're already being watched?" Lisa nodded grimly. "Exactly." Caroline's world began to close in around her. She had been so focused on protecting Jackson, on getting him to safety, that she had forgotten the one thing she couldn't outrun, the past. The people who had been involved in her husband's crimes hadn't just vanished. They were still out there, still watching, still willing to do whatever it took to keep their secret safe. "Then what do we do?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa's eyes were filled with fear and uncertainty. "We fight back." The air in the room felt thick with tension as Lisa's words hung heavy in the silence. Fight back. How could they fight against something so powerful, something so terrifying? Caroline felt the weight of the world pressing down on her chest as she stared at her sister. What could they possibly do? "Fight back," Caroline repeated, her voice barely audible. "How? We're just two women and a child. Who are we supposed to fight?" Lisa's eyes flashed with a fire Caroline hadn't seen before. "We find the truth. We dig into what your husband was really involved in. We find the people behind him. And we make them pay." Caroline shook her head, her thoughts spinning. She had no idea what Lisa was suggesting, but deep down, a spark of something ignited inside her. Was it hope? Desperation? Or maybe just the sheer will to protect Jackson at any cost? She didn't know. But she knew one thing: they couldn't run forever. "Look, Caroline," Lisa continued, her voice more insistent now. "You've already done the hard part. You've spoken the truth. Jackson spoke the truth. We just have to make sure that the people who want to bury that truth are held accountable. But to do that, we need to get ahead of them." Caroline bit her lip, torn between fear and the desperate need to take action. She glanced at Jackson, who had returned to the window, staring out at the street, his small face reflecting the weight of the world. "I'm scared, Lisa," Caroline admitted, her voice shaky. "I'm scared for him. For both of us." Lisa stepped closer, putting a hand on Caroline's shoulder. "I know. But you're not alone in this. We do this together. And we make sure Jackson stays safe." Jackson turned around then, his eyes wide and intense. "I want to help, Mom," he said quietly. "I want to make sure no one can hurt us." Caroline stared at her son, her heart swelling with pride and fear. How could he be so brave? He had already given so much. But now, he wanted to fight too. "I know you do, sweetheart," she said softly. "But this isn't your battle. You've already done enough. I just need you to stay safe. I need you to stay with me." Jackson nodded, but there was a look in his eyes that Caroline couldn't ignore. He wasn't a child who would sit by and watch. He had proven that today in the courtroom, and his resolve hadn't wavered. Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, we're going to need a plan. The people after you won't stop. And they've probably already started looking for us. We need to go underground, lay low until we can get some answers." Caroline's mind raced. She had no idea how they could pull this off. But she also knew she couldn't let fear rule her decisions. Jackson needed a future. A safe one. "And we'll need help," Lisa added, her voice low and serious. "I know people. People who can help us, who aren't afraid of going up against powerful enemies." "Who?" Caroline asked, still skeptical but desperate for any kind of lead. Lisa hesitated before answering, her voice barely a whisper. "I know a guy, a private investigator. He's not afraid to dig into things most people wouldn't touch. He can help us get answers, find out who's behind all of this. We can't do it alone." Caroline didn't need convincing. If there was a chance, even a slim one, to take control of the situation, she was willing to do whatever it took. "Okay," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it. Let's find out who we're up against." Lisa gave her a nod of approval. "We'll get started tomorrow. But for now, we lay low. Don't answer the phone to anyone. Don't trust anyone who knocks on your door unless it's me or someone you absolutely trust. We have to stay one step ahead." As the night deepened, Caroline felt the weight of the situation settle around her. But there was something else in the air now, a sense of purpose. A sense that they could take back control, even in the face of such overwhelming danger. But as she closed the door behind her sister and Jackson, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking in the shadows. She wasn't sure who it was, or what they wanted. But she knew they weren't done yet. And as the moonlight flickered through the blinds, Caroline's thoughts turned to one single question. Who else was watching them? The next morning, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up every time a car passed by, every time someone knocked at the door. Every little noise made her jump. Jackson, oblivious to her growing anxiety, went about his morning routine like any other child, his mind not yet fully grasping the magnitude of what was happening. Lisa had given her one piece of advice: stay calm. But that was easier said than done. The weight of everything, her husband's betrayal, Jackson's courage, the looming danger, was suffocating. Every time she tried to take a deep breath, it felt like the walls were closing in. Caroline glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for Lisa to arrive with the private investigator she had mentioned. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She wasn't sure about anything anymore. But she knew one thing: she couldn't afford to wait around, doing nothing. Every minute counted. Every second they spent in this house, in this neighborhood, was a risk. Jackson sat across from her at the table, eating his cereal. His small fingers gripped the spoon tightly as he ate, his eyes downcast. Caroline watched him, her heart heavy with guilt. He didn't deserve any of this. None of this was his fault. But he had stepped forward when no one else could. He had spoken the truth, even when it was the hardest thing anyone could do. "You're doing the right thing, Jackson," Caroline whispered, more to herself than to him. "We'll get through this." Just then, a knock at the door made her jump. It was sharp, urgent. Caroline's pulse spiked. She didn't recognize the sound of the footsteps outside, too heavy, too deliberate. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't ready for this. Not yet. Jackson looked up from his cereal, his eyes wide with concern. "Mom, are you okay?" Caroline forced a smile, masking the fear that was creeping into her bones. "Yeah, sweetheart. Everything's fine. Stay here." She moved to the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw who was standing there. It wasn't Lisa. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was a man. A tall, broad-shouldered figure in a black suit, his face hidden by dark sunglasses. He looked official. And he wasn't alone. Another man, smaller and more nervous-looking, stood at his side. Both men looked like they belonged to a world Caroline knew nothing about. The kind of world where secrets were traded and lives were destroyed. She froze. Should she open the door? Should she run? She didn't know. But just as she stood there, paralyzed by indecision, a sharp voice called out from the other side. "We know you're in there, Mrs. Walker. Open the door." Caroline's heart hammered in her chest. The men were already aware she was home. She had no choice now. With shaky hands, she unlocked the door, opening it just enough to see the men standing there. "We need to talk," the taller man said, his voice low and commanding. Caroline started, but the man cut her off. "Don't worry. We're not here to hurt you," he said, his eyes scanning the interior of the house, then landing back on her. "We just need to make sure you understand what you're up against." Caroline's stomach dropped. She knew instantly that this wasn't some random visit. These men weren't here to help. They were here to intimidate. The smaller man stepped forward slightly, glancing nervously at Jackson, who had appeared in the doorway behind Caroline. "We know you've been speaking to people," the tall man continued, his gaze cold. "You've made a mistake, Mrs. Walker. And we can fix it for you. We can make all of this go away." Caroline took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get Jackson out of there. But there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to sound stronger than she felt. The man's lips twisted into a cold smile. "We want you to stop looking into things. Stop asking questions. This is bigger than you think. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences." Caroline's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of their words, the threat in their tone. But she couldn't back down now. Not after everything. Not after Jackson had been so brave. "I'll never stop asking questions," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "I'll never stop until the truth comes out." The tall man's smile faded, and his gaze turned darker. "You don't understand, do you? The truth isn't something you can control. Not anymore." Before she could respond, Jackson stepped forward, standing beside Caroline. His small body was trembling, but his eyes were as fierce as any adult's. "We're not scared of you," Jackson said, his voice steady. The two men glanced at each other, surprised by the boy's boldness. But they quickly masked their shock, turning their attention back to Caroline. "You should be," the man said coldly. "You'll regret this." With that, the men turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Caroline stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. Jackson looked up at her, his face full of determination. "Are we okay, Mom?" Caroline didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she knew one thing for sure: they weren't safe. And they were running out of time. The house felt smaller after the men left. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, every car that passed outside seemed louder than it ever had before. Caroline shut the door slowly, locking it behind her, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the men had stood just moments before. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the fear settling deep into her bones. She wanted to collapse, to let the weight of everything wash over her, but she couldn't. Not now. Not when she had Jackson to protect. Jackson, on the other hand, seemed oddly calm. He stood beside her, his small hand gripping the edge of the door, his face serious as he watched the street outside. He had seen too much for a boy his age. He had lived through more than most people would ever understand. "Mom," Jackson's voice broke through her thoughts. "Do you think they'll come back?" Caroline took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice full of uncertainty. "But we have to be ready." She turned to him, meeting his gaze. "They don't want us digging into their secrets, Jackson. That means we have to keep pushing. We have to find out what's really going on. The truth can't stay buried." Jackson nodded, his expression hardening. "I'm not scared, Mom." Caroline felt a wave of pride wash over her. Despite everything, Jackson was still holding on to that fierce courage he'd shown in court. He wasn't backing down. But deep down, Caroline couldn't shake the fear that was gnawing at her. They had just been threatened. And while they'd been able to stand their ground for now, how much longer could they keep running from the truth, and the people trying to bury it? She glanced back at the window. The street was empty now, the shadows creeping in as night began to fall. But something felt off. Something felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that the men hadn't left. That they were watching, waiting, somewhere in the dark. The doorbell rang suddenly, sharp and urgent, making Caroline jump. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart skipped a beat. She rushed to the peephole, peering out. Her chest tightened when she saw who was standing there. It wasn't Lisa. It wasn't anyone she knew. The figure at the door was tall and broad-shouldered, just like the man from before. This time he was alone, but the look in his eyes was even more intense. Caroline's instincts screamed at her to stay quiet, to stay hidden. But Jackson, who had been standing silently behind her, stepped forward, his small hand grasping her wrist. "Mom, what do we do?" he whispered. Caroline turned to him, her eyes wide with panic. "Stay inside. Don't open the door." But Jackson was already moving toward the door, his expression resolute. "I need to do this, Mom," he said softly. "I have to keep us safe." Before Caroline could stop him, Jackson unlocked the door. She rushed forward to grab him, but it was too late. The man at the door stepped forward, his face cold and expressionless. "Is your mom home, kid?" he asked, his voice low and calm, but there was something in his tone that sent a chill down Caroline's spine. "Who are you?" Jackson asked, his voice steady despite the situation. "Why are you here?" The man looked down at Jackson for a moment, then slowly turned his gaze to Caroline. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice smooth, almost reassuring. "But I think you and your son need to understand that you're not just dealing with your husband's mistakes. You're dealing with something much bigger. Something you're not equipped to handle." Caroline's heart pounded as she stepped forward, shielding Jackson with her body. "What do you want from us?" The man smiled slightly, but it wasn't comforting. It was a warning. "We're offering you a chance, Mrs. Walker. A chance to walk away from all this. To leave it behind and keep your son safe. You don't have to keep digging. You don't have to keep fighting." Caroline shook her head, her voice firm despite the fear flooding her chest. "I'm not going to stop until the truth comes out. And I won't let you scare my son into silence." The man's smile faded. "You don't understand. There are people out there who will do far worse than scare you. This isn't just about you. It's about your son's future. Don't be naive. This is the last warning." Jackson stood tall beside Caroline, his eyes locked on the man. He was silent for a moment, but then he spoke, his voice quiet but fierce. "We're not afraid of you. We'll keep fighting for the truth." The man looked at Jackson for a moment, studying him, before letting out a small laugh. It wasn't kind. It wasn't warm. "You're brave, kid. But bravery won't save you from what's coming." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Caroline's legs felt like they might give out, but she stayed standing, holding Jackson close. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Jackson asked quietly. Caroline didn't answer immediately. She didn't know how to explain to her son that their lives had just been changed forever, that the fight they were in was bigger than either of them could fully comprehend. But she did know one thing. No matter how many threats came their way, no matter how dark things got, she wasn't going to back down. They weren't going to stop. The days that followed were a blur of constant fear and vigilance. Caroline and Jackson never left the house without looking over their shoulders, never spoke to anyone without wondering if they were being watched. The threats had escalated, but their resolve had only hardened. They had come too far to turn back now. Lisa had helped connect them with the private investigator, who had begun digging into the shadowy figures behind Caroline's husband's empire. What they uncovered was shocking, far worse than anything Caroline could have imagined. Her husband, it turned out, had been involved in an underground network that extended far beyond what Jackson had witnessed. The people they were up against were dangerous, ruthless, and had the resources to make sure their secrets stayed buried. But they couldn't stop now. The private investigator had put them in touch with a safe house, an undisclosed location where they could lay low while the investigation continued. But even as they packed their things, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't just looming, it was already there, already in their midst. As they drove to the new safe house, Jackson sat quietly in the back seat, his fingers lightly tapping on the window. He wasn't a child anymore. He had seen too much. He had already lost his innocence the day he spoke the truth in court. But Caroline saw something else in him now. Something stronger. A strength that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. The car came to a stop, and the driver turned to Caroline, giving her a nod. "We're here." They had arrived at a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town, nestled deep in the woods. It looked like any other abandoned place, run down, forgotten. But it was safe. For now. Caroline and Jackson stepped out of the car, their bags in hand, and walked toward the cabin. As they entered, the door creaked, and the quiet interior smelled of dust and neglect. But it was their new home, and for now, it would have to be enough. Later that evening, As the sun began to set and the cabin filled with the soft glow of lamplight, Caroline sat down at the small kitchen table. Jackson was already curled up on the couch, a book in his hands. It was almost surreal, the way their lives had changed so quickly. One moment, they had been living a quiet life in their old home, and now, they were hiding in the woods, on the run from an invisible enemy. Caroline reached for her phone, checking for any updates. The investigation was moving forward, but slowly. The people they were up against weren't easy to expose. They were hiding behind layers of corruption, with power that reached far beyond what Caroline could comprehend. But they were getting closer. The truth was coming. It had to. She looked up at Jackson, who had put his book down and was watching her quietly. His eyes were no longer wide with fear, no longer filled with confusion. He had a quiet confidence now, something that came from standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Caroline stood and walked over to him, sitting down next to him on the couch. "You did it, Jackson," she said softly. "You changed everything. You saved us." Jackson didn't say anything, but his small hand reached out to hold hers, his fingers warm against her skin. In that moment, she realized just how much he had grown. How much they both had grown. The door creaked open then, and the private investigator entered. His face was grim, his eyes filled with urgency. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. "They're coming," he said quietly. "They've found us." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Caroline stood up, her mind racing. "What do we do?" The investigator didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "We're going to confront them. It's time." Caroline felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The moment she had been preparing for. The final step. "Are you ready?" the investigator asked, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty. Caroline nodded, feeling a rush of determination surge through her. "We're ready." They gathered what little they could and prepared to face whatever came next. As they moved toward the door, Jackson stayed close to Caroline, his hand still clutching hers. They had come too far to stop now. The truth had to come out. And no matter what, they would fight for it, together. What do you think? Do you believe Caroline and Jackson can truly escape the people hunting them? What would you do if you were in their shoes? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for following this incredible journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.